We've been talking for a couple of weeks now about the commandment, the seventh commandment, which is do not commit adultery. And last week we began talking in some detail about what I think is the underpinning of that particular commandment, which is the importance of covenant to God. And that marriage being a covenant, and one of the more serious covenants that there is in the Bible, that would seem to have perhaps some bearing on why adultery is taken so seriously in the Jewish law. One thing I would point out, I would remind you of Paul's writings when he talks about the relationship between husbands and wives, and compares that to something else. What relationship does he compare that to, or does he tie that into Christ and the church? And we think about Christ's relationship with the church, which is a covenant relationship based on what?
Christ's covenant that He died for us, redeemed us, and in believing in Him, we have a threshold covenant with Him in His blood. Okay, that last word was actually all I was looking for, but you did get us there, so thank you. Blood. The covenant with Christ, with the church, is a covenant that is built on the foundation of His blood, that He shed for us, and that does all those things that Sylvia then also talked about, but that is the core of it. And so when we talk about the Christ relationship with the church, it is arguably the strongest covenant in all of the scriptures. And when you use the word church, of course, we're talking about the concept of the church universal, Christians in the kingdom of God throughout all of time and history. But when we look at that covenant, and we see the passage like the one that there's literally nothing in all of creation that is capable of separating us from the love of God. And we see other passages like that where nothing can take you away from Christ's hand except you. We get a clear sense of just how profound this covenant is. And Paul makes the decision to use that as the example or the relationship when he's talking about husbands and wives. Or in some ways, perhaps the reverse of that. Yeah. Because actually the passage really is saying, because he goes on, he says, but I was talking about Christ and the church. He's really using the marriage relationship to illustrate how powerful the relationship of Christ and the church is, which speaks volumes about how powerful Paul and other Christians presumably would have viewed the marriage relationship. So when we talk about a covenant, like I said, the relationship between Christ and the church is perhaps the strongest covenant in the scriptures, but that suggests pretty strongly that a marriage covenant may be the strongest or most powerful covenant that humans can form by themselves. Certainly one of the most powerful and one of the most significant ones, which is why breaking it is such a bad thing. And God doesn't like people who break faith. Even if it's not necessarily something with Him, He doesn't like people who break faith. And if you go through and you look in the Old Testament, there's a number of different nations that He curses, not because of necessarily some great idolatry or wrong or something like that, but because they were unfaithful or they did something that was sneaky or underhanded or something like that.
And all of the stuff you just said in the blood covenant with Christ reminded me of one of the strangest stories in the Old Testament where...
Just wait. I know what you're going to say, and we're going to get there in a second. Because it is one of the strangest stories in the Old Testament, so just wait.
But wait, there's more.
I know. It's an interesting one.
Okay.
But yeah, don't get ahead of it. Actually, let me make sure we are going to get to that, because if we aren't, then we might as well talk about it now. But I'm pretty sure... There it is, yeah, okay. Yeah, we're going to get to that. Maybe not today, but we will get to that as we talk about this, because well, you know. Anyway, okay, so let's try to move a little quicker then. So we talked about a covenant, and I gave you this definition of covenant last week. This idea of and in our culture, we would use the word contract much more often than we would use the word covenant. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, except that I think in our culture the value and concept of contract has been very much diluted by how relatively easy it is to get out of a contract. And even when we talk about the marriage contract, What that used to mean was marriage covenant. What it means today is it's just like any other contract. You can get out of it pretty easily. So, and the core of getting out of a contract, by the way, in American law is money. You pay some money, which is how divorce mostly works in America. There's a division of assets, pay some money, it's all taken care of. And when we look at, what God says about covenants, he's very much opposed to the idea of buying your way out of a covenant with money. Blood, maybe, but that's about it. So when we talk about covenants, we're talking about a higher standard than we usually apply to contracts, even though that term is essentially interchangeable with covenant, at least in older English and older English usages. So when we talk about covenants, though, we also need to understand the people involved. And most contracts today are between people who are considered to be relatively similarly situated. That's a term that we use in law, similarly situated. That means that both sides have a voluntary ability to decide whether or not they want to enter into the contract. Both sides are informed about what they are contracting for and understand the terms of the contract and therefore enter into it voluntarily and knowing what they're doing. Now, what are some of the reasons, some of the things that can happen that can undermine these assumptions or that go against these assumptions?
Well, in law today, things written into a contract would be weather can affect it.
Okay.
It becomes there's so many loopholes in the contracts that become
true, but that's actually not what I'm asking. What I'm asking is what could undermine the idea of the two parties being in parity, being similarly situated? What are some things that can affect that?
mental ability of one of the parties.
So if you have one of the parties to the contract who is impaired for some reason, for example, if you sign a contract when you're drunk, there's a decent chance you might get out of that if the other person knew you were drunk when you did it. Okay, what else?
Fraudulent misrepresentation.
Okay. Misrepresentation, fraud, those kinds of things, because inherently if somebody's lying, then several of those conditions I just mentioned are not met, because both sides don't actually know what's happening in the contract. They don't actually know what they're exchanging. One side has information that the other side doesn't have and is actively concealing it from them. So that's an extreme version. A less extreme version is a situation where one party simply lacks the information that they need to really understand what they're entering into. And that can happen sometimes. Even between people who are legitimately trying to do the right thing, you can have someone who just doesn't really understand what they're signing, and because of that, the contract is problematic because there was not what's called a meeting of the minds. Both parties didn't understand what they were agreeing to. What else? Jerry?
Just the influence of one party over the other.
Okay, that's a big one. Now, most of the time in America, because of the fact that we live in a free society and we try to avoid monopoly situations, the assumption is that when two parties enter into a contract, even if one of the parties is a big corporation and the other one's just a single individual, or in many cases, even if one of the parties is the government, in general, we are still assumed to be operating in a similarly situated situation because both parties have the ability to say, I'm not going to do that, right? So you go to Walmart and their prices are too high, and you say, I'm not going to pay that, I'm going to go somewhere else. Now, that can be undermined in a situation where one of the parties has an excessive amount of control. With the government, for example, there are certain functions that only the government controls. Licensing to drive, for example. So you can't go somewhere else to get your license to drive besides the government, which means that the government has to, be held to certain rules about how they're going to issue licenses and when they're going to say no and why they're allowed to do that. So you have external rules applied in situations where one side has excessive power. In a situation in a small town, for example, where you only have one grocery store, a grocery store that kept raising its prices up and up and up because there's no other choices, is on the surface of it, that is still a meaning of a transaction between equals because you can decide not to buy there. But there's no other alternatives, and so we regulate that under monopoly rules, where somebody can't abuse a monopoly power in order to take advantage of or excessively profit from the advantages that they have because of the situation. So we do things to try to prevent those things from getting out of control, but nevertheless, there are definitely situations, and it most often involves contracts or agreements with the government, where there is a significant disparity of power that cannot easily be remedied by the rules that we set up, or is subject to so many loopholes, to use Jerry's term, that a lot of times it can be very difficult to enforce parity between the people. One of the ones that I run into sometimes is that, in general, as an attorney, I am assumed automatically to have a full understanding of whatever contracts I enter into, whereas someone I enter into a contract with is generally assumed not to know enough to be able to guard themselves against me. Not me personally, but attorneys in general. And so one of the things attorneys almost always tend to do when they enter into a contract of any significance, and not to go buy groceries, don't get me wrong, but if they're going to buy property or form a corporation or a partnership with someone who's not an attorney, there is generally a requirement that you advise that person to go seek their own legal counsel in order to make sure that they have the opportunity to get the kind of information that the attorney has because of that disproportionate understanding of the legal system. So there's things like that. But for today, what we want to talk about and take a look at is what happens when you have power disparities. And particularly when you step away from our modern democratic form of government and you start thinking more about forms of government in the past, totalitarian or kings and emperors and things like that, who did not really have any limitations on their powers, didn't have a constitution or a set of rules and laws that governed what they could do. They made the laws and rules as they went along. Obviously, entering into an agreement with someone like that has some perils because they can abuse the agreement very easily. The line from The Empire Strikes Back, I have altered the deal, pray I don't alter it further, is kind of, none of you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, okay, so when we talk about the different kinds of contracts, biblically speaking, the first kind of contract that we encounter biblically is what's called a sovereign to vassal contract. Now, actually the term that was originally used for this is a suzerain to vassal contract, but suzerain means sovereign, and I think that it's easier to use a word that people are familiar with rather than one that sounds like it was made up by a Harry Potter writer. So we're going to call it the sovereign vassal covenant. And a sovereign vassal covenant is a covenant between a stronger party, the sovereign, the king, the lord of the manor, whatever it is, and a weaker party, the vassal. What's a vassal?
Subject to the higher authority.
Okay, someone who's subject to that higher authority. So a vassal could be a lord if the king is the sovereign, or the sovereign could be the lord and the vassal could be, a serf that works on their estate or whatever. So stronger and weaker party that creates benefits and obligations for both parties. So that means that the sovereign and the vassal have entered into a covenant, and both sides are doing something that's costing them something, and both sides are gaining something from this. This, setting aside the power disparity, is the standard form of most modern day contracts. I want to buy a car from you. You have to give up the car, which is an asset that has value and utility to you, and I have to give up money. I get a car, which has value and utility to me, and you get money, which has value to you to buy other things. So that's an exchange of goods or services. Both sides are giving something up. Both sides are benefiting in some way. So this is a sovereign and vassal covenant. Again, the term suzerain vassal is the one that actually sometimes shows up there. So an example of this is in Genesis chapter 12. The Lord said to Abram, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land of which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who curse you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. Now we read this, and it's not hard at all to see where Abraham is benefiting from this. But what is God getting? What is his side of the bargain?
All nations will be blessed.
Okay, well, technically that's true. That one's true too, but there's actually something that's specific in the covenant.
Oh, specific in the covenant? What I was going to say was that he is establishing the relationship through which the Messiah will come, chosen people that ultimately will fulfill his will to save the world.
Okay, so there is an underlying benefit that Abraham is not even aware of at this time that God is getting out of the covenant. So that is worth noting, although technically that would make it a a contract that probably would not be honored in America, because that means that one side knows something that they're getting out of the contract and the other side doesn't know about, but that's a whole different thing. So, Sylvia, go ahead, and then I'm gonna go over here to Linda.
It's also the loyalty to Abraham, his family, his guidance. If you with him, which Abraham is with God, you be blessed. But if you go against Abraham, watch out.
Okay, that's a whole different set of promises. We're gonna get to that maybe later on, but you're right. There is consequences that flow out of this covenant that are bigger than even the ones that we're talking about right here, such as what Ken is talking about, as well as what you're talking about. Linda.
God's establishing his chosen nation.
Okay, that's true.
And so that's his nation, and they're to be,
They're gonna be his.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and all of that is true, but there's an easier answer to this.
God is getting the obedience of Abraham
To do what?
to listen to him,
Nope,
to go to
to
the
do what?
nation,
There, to do what? In there.
Go to Canaan.
There we go.
What?
Go.
Yeah.
This is actually really easy. It's not. I don't mean to make it this hard for you. You're all biblical scholars, and so you're running ahead of me here. This is the simple version. Go. So Abraham is giving something up. Remember, both sides have to give something up. Both sides have to get something. God is giving up, or he is giving Abraham these promises, which means he's basically choosing him and excluding all other people. So he's giving something up as well as giving something to Abraham. In exchange, Abraham is showing his obedience by going. And so God both receives his obedience, which leads into all this other stuff, but Abraham has to go. He has to do something. So God isn't just establishing a relationship by saying, hey, here's all these blessings. He's saying, I need to see you obey in order for all this to happen. So that's where this covenant comes from. Otherwise, we don't have the kind of covenant I just described. We have a different kind of covenant. We'll get to that one in a minute here. But unless both sides have to do something, it's not the same kind of covenant. A sovereign vassal covenant requires both sides to have duties and obligations, not just one side. So that's what we're looking at here. Okay.
And he's basically giving up his relatives too.
That's true. Yeah, when he says go, it's more than just move. It's leave your family behind, leave security behind, go. And I mean, this is actually the second phase in the going, because initially they moved from Ur to the northern end of Canaan, basically, and that's where his father stopped. And then Abram is called to go on further into Canaan itself. And so yeah, he has to leave his relatives behind, leave the security behind, and basically just be a wanderer, which was not what he was back in Ur. He is now no longer got a settled place to live, and he has to accept that in exchange for these promises and other ones that will come later as well. Okay, so we have a sovereign vassal covenant. Then we have a royal grant, and this is the kind I was kind of previewing as we talked about this a little bit here. A royal grant is a covenant between a sovereign and a vassal that creates obligations for the sovereign and benefits for the vassal, but not in the reverse order. So this is a king saying, I'm going to give everybody in my land a break from taxes this month, or I'm going to give everybody in my land a goose for Christmas, or whatever it might be. He's giving something out, and he's not asking for anything back. So in the first example, if it hadn't been for the go, if God had just come in and said to Abraham, I'm going to make you a great nation, I'm going to bless you, I'm going to make your name great, you shall be a blessing, bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you, in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. If he hadn't said go to the land which I will show you, it wouldn't be an exchange of anything. It would just be, here's a bunch of stuff I'm promising you. So in the case of a royal grant, the promises are made from the sovereign to the vassal. So the example of that we see over in Genesis chapter 15. So now Abraham has gone. He is now in the land. So that covenant has, the conditions of that covenant have been met. Now God has got a lot more to do to wrap the covenant up. But as far as Abraham is concerned, he's done all the stuff God told him to. He went to the land and he's now there. So Abraham receives a vision from God. It says, all these things, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision, saying, do not fear, Abram. I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great. And he took him outside and said, now look toward the heavens and count the stars if you were able to count them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. Then he believed the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. So there's two different things going on here. Don't get them confused. The first thing is a series of promises that God makes to Abraham. I'm a shield, your reward is going to be great. Count the stars, that's how your descendants are going to be. That is a distinct promise from the previous ones that he'd made that were tied into the go. And so now he's saying, I'm doing this for you too. Now there's no additional obligations placed on Abraham. But what comes out of that is that Abraham, it says, believed the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. So there's something else that happens here that's not really, I mean, it's tied into the covenant, but it's not part of the covenant itself, which is that Abraham's faith is rewarded by a reckoning of righteousness. And this could be arguably seen as a covenant that underpins and is sort of a deeper covenant than the ones that we've been talking about here that has to do with faith and righteousness. That is a whole different study, and we're not going to do that right now. But there's probably a way, it's not probably, there's definitely a way we could go and take a look at that. Similarly, well, no, so actually this one's a question for you guys. This one, what kind of covenant is this? He says, it's Genesis chapter 17. Now when Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abraham and said to him, I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless. I will establish my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you exceedingly. Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, as for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you will be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. For I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings will come forth from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your descendants after you. I will give to you and to your descendants after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. God further said to Abraham, now as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. An uncircumcised male shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. Okay, so what kind of covenant are we talking about here?
Sovereign vassal.
Sovereign vassal. There are two different places where Abraham is called on to do something. Did you catch that? The second one, circumcision's right there in front of you. What's the first one?
Keep.
Keep.
The first screen you had up there.
Okay. Walk before me and be
Walk
blameless.
before me.
Okay? Now this is an interesting one. I'll be honest with you, I'm not 100% sure that this is actually saying to Abraham to do that. I think that it is a possible interpretation that what God is actually saying is, if you walk before me, I will make you blameless. Not walk before me and be perfect and then I'll do all this other stuff, because Abraham is not going to be perfect. He's not going to be blameless. He's going to be made blameless by walking before God. So even so, that would still be a covenant because he's got to do the walking in order for that to work.
Well, it's just the outgrowth of his faith being reckoned to him as righteousness.
Yes.
Righteousness, blameless,
Right.
very similar concept.
And so the relationship is what makes him blameless. He's not saying to be blameless, otherwise the covenant won't work. He's saying, I think more accurately, you're blameless because you're walking before me, and here's the rest of the covenant. One of the things that's striking about this particular covenant is, if you had to, if you were just the average attorney advising your clients about whether this was a fair deal for both sides, who got the best of this contract? Abraham. Now granted, the circumcision thing is kind of a high bar considering that he's already an older man, but still, when you look at all the stuff that he's getting out of this, the multitude of nations, fruitful, the kings descending from him, he's going to be their God. And I mean, we're so used to that idea on one level that we don't really appreciate what that really means. But all the other nations of the world had gods, but what were their gods?
Meddlers.
False gods. Whether they were completely made up idols or possibly evil spirits masquerading as gods, we don't know. The scriptures seem to indicate it could be a mix of those two things. But in any event, none of them were God. And so God is saying, you are going to be my people, and I am going to be your God. I'm going to be your God specifically, not everybody else's God. Now, he's still God over the world, and he's still, the scriptures talk about he's kind to everybody and stuff like that. But you guys are the special ones. You guys are the ones that are going to be chosen, and that you're going to be favored and stuff like that. So this is a huge deal. He's going to get the land for to the descendants, Canaan for an everlasting possession. Okay, let's do Sylvia and Linda.
My thing said, Abram, and he said to him, I am El Shaddai, the God Almighty, continually walk before me and it will be blameless. So God makes him blameless.
Right.
It's not that Abraham has to do a
Right.
blameless. You can't.
That has been my interpretation of that passage for a number of years since I really started studying this issue.
That's
Linda.
what I was gonna say, but the covenant usually, I mean, were sacrifices with animals without blemish.
Mhm.
And so then I was gonna say the same thing
Right.
Sylvia said,
Okay,
to walk blameless.
so yeah, so there's this idea of walking blameless, but it's not because you're perfect, it's because God is making you perfect. So, okay, so he's gonna give him all this stuff, and he keeps on going. It's like, well, but wait, there's more, you know. What's behind door number 2, you know? Actually, that's you can go wrong on you. So then he gives him the covenant. The covenant on his side, besides just walking before him and having that relationship, is circumcision. There's an expectation that they're going to be different than all the people around them. Paul will later on talk about circumcision as a seal, basically a way to differentiate between Israel and the nations around them and prove that they had God's favor on them. So this is something that we look at as a, you know, at least arguably a negative, and certainly in the moment it would have been, but it is a profoundly significant act and a profoundly significant covenant that God is choosing. And it's also interesting because it involves blood. And so many of God's covenants do involve blood in some way, whether it's the sacrifice of Jesus, whether it's circumcision, whether it's something else. And God will make points about blood on any number of occasions about how important it is and how vital it is. So, okay, so this is where we get into the weird stuff. I think this is probably what Ken was thinking of. If not, then this is not what you're, okay. So then we'll get to that in a minute here. Well, I'm going to let you talk about what you were thinking of then in a minute here. So, Abraham has received all these different promises from God. The problem is that Abraham, you know, he's having a little trouble believing some of these promises. What is going on? Okay, there we go. I've got my notes out of order and it was making no sense at all. He's having a little trouble believing this. Why might he be having trouble believing this?
Age from himself and
Okay.
Sarah. I mean, they were not in childbearing age.
No, they were not. So he's being told he's going to have descendants, and yet the math doesn't seem to add up for that. And on top of that, by this time, by the time he's having this conversation in Genesis 17, this is a number of years after God has already promised him he's going to have descendants, and he still doesn't have it. So he's probably starting to worry, not only, you know, I'm too old, but also you don't seem to be moving very quickly on your part of the promise. Now, by this time, Abraham has become very wealthy, so he certainly has seen at least one benefit from God's favor. But most of the things that God promised him, and make no mistake, Abraham considered his wealth as a very minor thing. Most of the things that God has promised him are either things that are going to happen after he's dead, like the inheritance of the land, or they haven't happened at all yet. They haven't even gotten started yet. And so Abraham's getting nervous that maybe God isn't really going to keep his promises, or maybe more accurately, that God has a different definition of his promises. And, you know, that can be true sometimes. I mean, we want to, you know, before you start to get down on Abraham for thinking that, remember that that for most Jews, the Messiah was a massive head fake in terms of what they were expecting. You know, they thought Messiah was going to be conqueror and military leader and king in the real world, not real world, in the world, in the physical sense, and they got something totally unexpected. So it's not unheard of for God to make promises that don't quite mean what the people who receive those promises think. So he says, God says, I'm the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land and possess it. And Abraham's response is, or Abraham's response, because he's been renamed by now, O Lord God, how may I know that I will possess it? He wants some evidence. So God said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought all these to him and cut them in two and laid each half opposite each other, but he did not cut the birds. So he's offering, it appears that he's offering a sacrifice. But it's a really weird kind of a sacrifice because you don't normally cut the animals in half as part of it. By the way, do you know what it would be involved in cutting a cow in half? By yourself? in the pre-Iron Age. I mean, this is not an easy thing to do, but in any event, he does this. So he lays them kind of across from each other. This is a grisly sort of a scene, by the way. But anyway, he lays them across from each other, and then things get really weird. Because it says, when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram. And behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. And it came about when the sun had set, that it was very dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch which passed between these pieces. Now, an oven is not like the range that you have in your home. This is something more mobile, but it's a smoking torch, smoking oven, flaming torch, which passed between the pieces. And on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your descendants I have given this land from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. Now, we read that and we think this is just a very, very odd set of events. But to understand the context, you need to understand that in the context of what they were doing, what has happened is that God has now passed between blood, and blood that comes from animals that have been separated. Basically, he's passing between two halves of a whole. This is a very profound way of signifying the significance of a covenant. So you think about it, we have, not so much today because of diseases and stuff like that, but it used to be you spit in your hand and you shook hands, and that made it a more powerful agreement. That is the successor to you cut your hand and the other person cut their hand and you shook hands and made it a really powerful agreement. This is like that on steroids, basically. So there's blood involved, there's death involved, and there is a very, very solemn thing. So God, and this is really key, God has manifested in a physical avatar, I guess, for lack of a better term. Not the blue people in the movie from James Cameron, but in a physical way, so that he can pass between these things. He is there. Now, that's not all of him by any means, but he is there, just like when later on he's going to come to Abraham with his two angels, and he's going to meet with him. He was physically there. That wasn't all of God, but God chose to represent himself to Abraham as a man in that situation. Here he chooses to represent himself as basically fire, or forms of fire. But he does it in a way that's not as threatening as the way he does it, for example, on Mount Sinai when he meets with the Israelites. But nevertheless, he physically manifests an aspect of himself so that he can pass between these things, which is basically God. It would sort of be the equivalent of you getting down on your knees to promise an ant that you're not going to kill it. I mean, that's kind of the conversation that you're having here, is that God is lowering himself to be incarnated in a way to show Abraham just how serious he is about this promise. So this is a very powerful thing, even though it's not something that that necessarily makes a lot of sense to us. It's a very powerful action that God is taking in order to signify the covenant and to show the power of his words, and that he's not just making promises, that this is really going to happen. Okay? So, let me take a stop here, because I told Ken that I thought this was what you were going to be talking about, but you have something else in mind, so I'm curious what that is.
Well, it came from your discussion about Paul using the marriage relationship to demonstrate the relationship between Christ and the church, which is a blood covenant. In Exodus 4, Moses has gone to his father-in-law, says, I want to go back to Egypt, and he says, go. And they're on their way, and on the way, God's telling him all these things. He says, okay, Pharaoh is not going to listen, my heart is hard, but at the end, I'm going to kill all his firstborn, and then he'll listen to you. And at a lodging place, Exodus 4:24, on the way, the Lord met him, Moses, and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah, Moses' wife, took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me. So he, God, let him, Moses, alone. It was then that she said, a bridegroom of blood, because of the circumcision. So there we see, wrapped up in not just a marriage relationship, but Moses' very life being spared by a blood covenant.
Okay.
And that's a strange story.
It is, and actually it was in the line of things I was going to get to eventually, but I couldn't remember that I even had that in there until you started reading that. So it's an interesting, well, okay, let I'm getting ahead of myself here. So, so we have this, again, we have a blood situation, the circumcision situation. This is a very weird situation because Moses has been appointed by God to go and get the Israelites out of captivity in Egypt. And yet, he is out of compliance with God's law. In fact, if the story is linear, he was out of compliance with God's law when God called him to go do that. But he still didn't fix it until the Lord is about to kill him. And this is kind of one of the interesting side notes to me on this one is that how did Zipporah know that God was there? Did he manifest himself again in some way? And how did Moses end up sleeping through that? You know, I don't know. Anyway, so the point is...
It was the son that was circumcised, not Moses.
The son was not circumcised.
Yeah, Zipporah circumcises a son,
Right.
not Moses.
Right. No, maybe I misspoke.
When you said slept through, I thought you meant Moses.
No, what I'm asking is how did, when God shows up, normally you'd think that would get your attention. But, you know, so that's what I'm curious about is when we read this story, it says the Lord met him, and it's kind of like how now maybe Moses was awake too, and Zipporah was the one who had the clarity of mind to go take care of the problem. But this is there's a lot of weird stuff about this story in terms of what's going on here and how this, kind of how this sort of breaks down. But the blood aspect of it is unmistakable. Once again, you have this idea of blood and, because of the circumcision. So let me step back a little bit here. And here again, we have blood. Exodus 24, 7 through 8. Moses took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. This is after he received the Ten Commandments, and it's not entirely clear if he received all of the law at this point, because the book of Exodus goes on talking about the laws long after this. So it's much more likely this is the Ten Commandments. But in any event, Moses took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient." So Moses took the blood, this is the blood of a sacrifice that had been offered, and sprinkled it on the people and said, "Behold the blood of the covenant, which the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." Aren't you glad we don't live in that day and age, and I'm not up here with a little bowl and sprinkling blood on all of you as you sit here and you leave worship and you're like, that was the most horrendous experience of my life. So, so this is blood, and so the covenants, and every year when they would do the Day of Atonement, there was blood sprinkled, and there was blood associated with that, and there's the sacrifices done every day, and there's blood associated with it. So once the Mosaic Law gets instituted, blood is a part of the covenant every day. And even if you didn't attend the temple, on a daily basis, you didn't live in Jerusalem, or before that when it was the tabernacle, wherever it happened to be based, Shiloh or whatever, even if you weren't there on a daily basis, you were still reminded of these things. And you were mindful that you would have to sacrifice if you committed certain kinds of sins. All of this is blood related.
And that's why the Hebrew writer says in 9:22, "Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins."
Yeah. And that takes us back to what I mentioned earlier about the importance of blood. And in the context of a covenant, or at least the really important covenants, blood is always associated with those things. So, okay, we've talked about this one already. So let's go on to Genesis. Now this is really profound. When God comes down with his angels and is heading down to Sodom and Gomorrah to pronounce judgment on those cities, he first appears to Abraham while Abraham is camped at the Oaks of Mamre, which we don't know exactly where that was, but anyway, he's camped there, and God shows up, and Abraham initially, it's fairly clear, does not recognize any of them as being supernatural entities. He simply recognizes them as being humans, men on a journey, and the rule for Middle East hospitality is when you encounter somebody on a journey, you feed them and give them a place to rest and those kinds of things. So he immediately, says, sit down, put your feet up, and he hurries to make food and have Sarah make some food, and basically says, you guys got to eat something, and they do, because God is there in part to talk to Moses. And so, Abraham, sorry. Every once in a while that slips out. So Abraham brings the food back, and then he feeds them, and he doesn't eat, because that's the rule. He doesn't eat, he just feeds them and kind of stands there, probably nervously wringing his hands to make sure that if they need anything, he can run and get it for them. Again, not because he's necessarily aware that he's encountered God or anything supernatural, but because that's what you do, and Abraham was the kind of person who absolutely would have done that sort of thing. So at some point in the conversation, though, because God begins to talk to Abraham, and they don't really, the scriptures don't say what the nature of the conversation is until the part we're going to look at in a second here. But it kind of sounds like maybe it started off as just like, how's it going, how are things, what you doing, and stuff like that. But at some point, it appears that Abraham begins to realize that who he's talking to is not just, three guys on a journey. That there's something more going on here. Now, whether he realizes it's God before God really makes it clear who he is, it's not entirely clear. But what happens after all this discussion is that, and kind of getting together, talking and stuff and eating, is that the men get up and they're ready to leave. They're going to head on down to Sodom and Gomorrah because that's where their journey is taking them. But then we have internal monologue from God, which we don't get a lot of that, by the way, in the Bible. There's a few places, but not very many. We have an internal conversation that God has with himself about what he should do in this situation. In Genesis chapter 18, the Lord said to himself, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, since Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed? For I have chosen him, so that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about him." So, what God is planning to go do, of course, is to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. He's going to pass judgment, but he's God, so already knows what the situation is. It's really not a question of whether he's going to, it's going to be good or not. He already knows. So why is he concerned about talking to Abraham about this ahead of time? Why is he concerned about letting Abraham know what he's doing? What does he say here?
Well, I have this special relationship I've chosen to have with him.
Okay.
For I have chosen him. And since he is in that prime position with God, how can God not disclose to him what he's going to do that affects nearby neighbors, affects the land of Canaan, and affects Lot?
Okay. So one of the things, and I think that there's two key things I see here. And one of them is that I think that God feels an obligation out of that covenant that he has with Abraham to let Abraham know when he's going to do something, as Ken says, that is so profound, to let him know, here's why I'm doing it. Here's what's going on. So that Abraham isn't sort of left holding the bag after something really bad happens, and it maybe isn't left confused about what's going on. God feels a sense of obligation because of that covenant, and because of his relationship with Abraham. So there's that. Anything else? Any other reason?
I was going to say Lot's there,
Okay.
and I'm part of Abraham's family. So it's kind of like this, hey, if I don't say, I'm going down to wipe this place off the face of the earth,
Right.
complete. And Lot would be part of that, having Abraham, he'd telling Abraham, and going, the story keeps going.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like Lot had pretty much settled there in the middle of all this,
Yeah.
these problems.
He lives in the city,
Right. So, not to have God say, hey, I'm
Yeah.
going down there to destroy it.
And it's interesting to note that the New Testament writer refers to Lot as righteous Lot, even in the middle of all this stuff here. So apparently Lot had maintained his righteousness even while living in this city that was so evil. So there is a factor of that. Linda.
Well, he's got descendants there too.
Okay.
Lot.
Yeah, so it's him and his
So
family.
it's more than just
Yeah.
Lot, it's more
Right,
family. Yeah.
right. Sylvia.
Well, God had the foreknowledge. That's no surprise to him. He knew that Abraham will bargain with him.
Well, hang on. We'll get to that in a second. That's the next thing we want to talk about. So just hold that thought for a second, because there's one other point I want to make out of this. Because notice what he says here: "I have chosen him, so that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about him." What I would submit to you is that part of what God is saying here is I need to make sure he understands why I'm doing this, so that he understands that this is a righteous thing to do and not just a destructive, unnecessary, cruel thing to do. So part of this is an explanation to, now, probably didn't have to explain very much. He's, you know, once he says what he's doing, Abraham's like, oh yeah, I know those people. I get it. But I mean, the fact that Abraham felt necessary to bargain out of 10 righteous men knew he had to suggest he had a pretty good sense of how messed up those cities were. But nevertheless, God is articulating that Abraham needs to understand why this has happened. And this is an important principle for us as well, that we need to understand the scriptures, because sometimes this can be really hard to explain to people why bad things are happening, or why, you know, things, the way that they characterize the scriptures is not very accurate. If we can't explain that, and we don't have an understanding of that, we oftentimes end up looking like we don't really understand what we believe, or that our God is a very capricious and random kind of a God. And so God wants to make sure that Abraham has the information he needs. So, with that in mind, it says that the men had gone down to, the two men, the angels, headed on down to Sodom and Gomorrah, and in the most translations today, and most of the oldest texts, and then the subsequent ones that were written based on those, it says the Abraham remained standing before the Lord. There is an interesting tradition, or a group of texts that was written in between some of the very oldest ones and some of the newer ones that actually say the Lord remained standing before Abraham, which suggests a really weird power dynamic, because normally the guy that's standing is the guy who feels an obligation or is responsible to the other party. And either one of them would not be inconsistent with what we're seeing here, but the fact that the text says it two different ways depending on who was making copies suggests that there was an understanding of a relationship between God and Abraham that is not the sort of relationship that we see God having with most humans, and feeling an actual obligation to stay and talk to him. Nevertheless, he does. God expresses what he's planning to do, and that's when
Abraham bargained with God about if there's so many righteous men, you know, God, I think he started by 100, he got down to 10.
Yes.
And till this day, for the Jews, 10 means a million. If their Saturday morning not have 10 men, well, you could count one Torah scroll as the 10th man, but if they not have, they cannot open up to get the Torah scroll out. It's still the million of 10.
You need a minimum of 10. So now, there's a lot of things that I find interesting about that story. Particularly, I just enjoy the fact that Abraham just keeps on pushing, you know, and just, you know, and it's, we don't know what the look on God's face was when this is going on. Of course, God doesn't normally have a face to have a look on it, but I would tend to think it was kind of amusement at some point, you know, because this guy is just willing to keep on trying, you know. At some point, God's got to be like, dude, you got some real guts on you there, you know. But because by this time it's clear Abraham knows he's talking to God, and yet he is negotiating with God, and he keeps saying, can I bother you for one more second? You know, basically, that's what he said. And I think it's really interesting because Abraham and Moses are the two, if you look in the scriptures, the two who, in situations like this, actually did negotiate with God to spare people's lives. Moses does it here with Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham does it here with Sodom and Gomorrah. Moses does it a couple of different times with the Israelites when God says, I'm sick of all of them, I'm going to wipe them all out. And Moses kind of, if we were talking about God, what I would say is he talked him off the ledge, but that's God. God's not on the ledge. But he talks him down basically from his wrath and saves the Israelites. And the reason I think that's funny, and I don't like ethnic stereotypes typically, but there is an ethnic stereotype of Jews being really good lawyers. And these two things would seem to suggest there's some fact to that, you know, because these guys are able to talk God down and to negotiate with God. And if you can negotiate with God, you're a better lawyer than most of us are. So in any event, that's kind of what we see coming out of this, but it's all relationship based. And that's really important. It's relationship based when Abraham does it, and it's relationship based when Moses does it. They're not just winging it with God. They have a deep and abiding covenant relationship, and God honors that relationship by listening to them.
And not only that, Abraham was called what? The friend of God.
Yep.
And you can do these kind of things with your friends.
And elsewhere, Moses is called the most humble man ever, basically. So, Mark, one last thought here.
I just think, now here's God in the, looking like a man. And so that has you know, you got this all-powerful being.
Right.
Now it seems like to me, it'd be more like, okay, he's a man, I can kind of talk to this guy.
Right.
He's more like a friend.
Right.
So we can talk back and forth, and I can bargain with the man. I can't bargain with this all-powerful being that could do that to me.
That
if
may
he
be
wants to.
true, yeah.
So maybe he thought, maybe, okay, now he's the man.
It makes it feels different, yeah. And I think that speaks to that relationship thing as well, because God chose to present himself to Abraham as a man. He didn't show up the way he did on Sinai and thunderclouds and lightning and everything else and say, I'm going down to Sodom to destroy it. Because I don't think Abraham probably, as you said, I don't think he probably would have tried to argue at that point. He shows up as a man. He starts off interacting with Abraham in a totally normal way, and it's in the course of the conversation that Abraham starts to realize something else is going on here that's just bigger than just 3 visitors. But God never overwhelms Abraham with who he is, the way that he so often does, especially in the Old Testament, with people who encounter him. He has a very subdued manner with him. And I think that's very much a function of the relationship that they've had and that they will continue to have. Which is, as Paul says, it's really unlike any relationship in the Old Testament. And the closest we come to that actually is our relationship with God. That we now have a friendship with God that is akin to Abraham's because it's based in faith and grace and righteousness.
And blood.
And blood, that's true too. All right, so hold that last thought there, because when we wrap this up next week, hopefully we're going to wrap it up next week, we're going to talk about how that relates back to the marriage aspect of this a little bit more. But again, that's for next week. So thank you guys for your participation.